Hi, I'm Charlie Steiner, and welcome to ESPN Classic Sportscenter Flashback. A Norwegian immigrant raised on Chicago's South Side, he considered attending the University of Illinois until Knute, or Knute if you prefer to say it in his native tongue, followed some friends to an obscure Catholic college in Indiana. The school, of course, was Notre Dame, and by the time Coach Rockne was done building it into the greatest college football power in the country, it didn't matter how you pronounced his first name because everyone knew who he was and what he had done. But when he was killed in a plane crash at just the age of 43, the effect rolled like an earthquake from sea to shining sea.
It was almost the size of President Kennedy's type impact. It was amazing. They turned out on the train and at the funeral, and he was a national hero.
The funeral was broadcast not only all over America by CBS, but it went by shortwave to Europe, to Asia, to South America. So the man literally touched all of this country and really beyond.
Stores closed or stopped operating in South Bend, and people listened to the funeral. It was really this huge civic occasion.
I was probably something like 200 feet away, closer to the administration building, and it was just a mass of people. I rarely got to see it because of the crowd.
There were more than 2,000 people that jammed the cathedral at Notre Dame.
Outside, there was another 10,000 people. And South Bend, which at that time, population of South Bend was about 100,000 people, there were about 100,000 people that lined the funeral route from the home on East Wayne Street up to the Basilica.
And we're not talking about just South Bend people, we're talking about people, other coaches, friends of Rockne, that were too numerable to name, but it was a great tribute to a great man.
President Herbert Hoover, still in the White House at that time, sent a telegram of regret to the family, to Bonnie, his wife.
It was a time when presidents really didn't associate with sports figures. Sports were seen as somewhat disreputable, and Hoover was a very starchy kind of Republican, but he realized that Rockne had this tremendous importance to the American public.
King Haakon of Norway sent his regrets. He was born in 1888 in Voss, Norway. He died in Bizarre, Kansas, 1931. So he was 43 years old. And imagine all that he had done in those few years of his life to dominate intercollegiate football.
Knute Rockne was the god of college football coaches, and no one ever thought of college football without Knute Rockne.
First time I met him was in 1922, and it was like meeting the Lord.
Rockne's rise to mythological status was rooted in the most fertile of eras, the Roaring '20s. Millions of Americans, many of them fresh from the battlefields of World War I, had the time, the money, and the inclination to celebrate themselves on fields of play.
And it came at a period of time when America was looking for heroes. Take a look at the 1920s and say, name one great or two great politicians from the 1920s. You can't do that, but you can name 6, 8, 10 sports figures.
The 1920s were a period of phenomenal prosperity in America. People were getting their first car, getting their first refrigerator, getting their first telephone. People have more money for disposable income and leisure time. For the first time in the 1920s, newspapers see how readers love sports. They start having sports sections.
There were a number of men in the press boxes in those years writing sports, led by Grantland Rice, Ring Lardner, and Damon Runyon. These men were icons too, and they wrote very flatulent, hyperbolic sports prose.
They made these men bigger than life. They were very pro-hero, and you almost didn't mention any faults that anyone had if you knew about them.
It had a tremendous impact on the sports-loving public. and a public that was very desirous of getting away from what had happened in 1916, 17, 18 in Europe.
Also, the invention of the radio was critical in the rise of Knute Rockne as a coaching icon. By the end of the decade, 14 million homes had radios.
Radio is immediately interested in broadcasting sports. The networks that came out of New York talk to the Ivy League schools and they say, well, pay us. Then they come to Notre Dame and Notre Dame says, no, we'll let you broadcast for free.
He sneaks the right tackle, and he's going over for a touchdown for Notre Dame.
All of a sudden, Notre Dame football games are being played on the radio in different parts of the country.
He just became one of those personalities aided and abetted by the national press, the national sports media, and he became one of the Roaring Twenties icons.
During that period of the 20s, there were three very distinctive voices in America that people heard over the radio. My grandfathers, Will Rogers, and Babe Ruth.
And when I think of all these hundreds of thousands of young men playing football this fall, out there on the gridiron, giving all they have, showing those qualities of loyalty, chivalry, courage, spirit of self-sacrifice.
Rockne, aside from being a good coach, was one of the really great press agents. I think Notre Dame was the first one to think, the national press. How do we impress the national press?
My grandfather, on different occasions, had pseudonyms that he used to write newspaper articles, and they would appear in different papers across America.
One of those articles, believed to be written by Rockne, appeared on Mondays in the South Bend Tribune under the byline, Bearskin.
Most of the people had the feeling that Rockne was the author of Bearskin, because who else would know as much as was appearing in these articles all the time? All I know is that after Rockne died, there was no more Bearskin in the South Bend Tribune.
Rockne was enormously important as a self-promoter, and self-promoters are very successful in our country and very successful in sports.
I suspect he would have been successful whether he was selling refrigerators in Alaska or tobacco in North Carolina. He was a lot of things, but boy, he knew how to market. He knew how to sell a product.
Anything that moved and could make him a buck, he was there. I mean, he really understood American capitalism and freelance capitalism.
Rockne's popularity, of course, was enhanced by his ability to inspire through his pitching and through his banquet speeches and through his association with the Studebaker Company. In fact, they named a car after him.
The Studebaker Motor Car Company created a car called the Rockne. There were 36,000 of them sold in the 1930s, and the last I heard, there were collector's items, and there were 9 of them still in existence.
He was really one of the very first to do any kind of advertisement, to move the coach out of the arena of coaching and being a public figure that did commercials.
I think Notre Dame became a special place thanks to Knute Rockne. Special guy at a special time. Great salesman for Notre Dame. And yet, at that point in time, Notre Dame, which was a little place in the middle of nowhere, needed something like that to get what? To get football prominence. With somebody like Rockne, you got what amounts to a dynasty.
After emigrating from Norway in 1893, Rockne's road to fame started in South Bend. An undersized fullback, he was shifted to end, where he became a standout when Notre Dame exploited a new offensive weapon, called the forward pass.
In 1912, when he played on the Notre Dame team as an end, and a very good end, he combined with a quarterback named Gus Doré, and Doré and Rockne had worked out during the summer throwing passes to each other, and they had decided to use this as a main instrument of offense in football.
They used the pass against Army, and it was a great success, and they beat Army 35-13, and that made famous Doré and Rockne.
After graduation in 1914, Rockne was hired as an assistant coach to Jess Harper. 4 years later, he took over the reins and began to drive Notre Dame to national prominence.
89, 42, 21. Hip. 1, 2, 3. Hip. All right, come on, Bennett. Get up, come on. Oh, that's the way. That's the way to get him. Now, that's something like it.
He got people interested in football who normally would not be interested in football. People who never cared about college football went to see Notre Dame.
Representing a small Roman Catholic college in Protestant-dominated Middle America, Rockne's hard-hitting football team soon became the focus of the urban working class, especially the Irish Catholics.
The Catholics, as immigrants coming to America, did not have a lot to identify with in terms of success. And then there was this institution out in South Bend, Indiana, the University of Notre Dame, that was a Catholic school.
There were a lot of people who didn't go to college, especially a lot of Irishmen who didn't go to college, who then adopted Notre Dame and became the Subway alumni.
Once Rockne started having success, it was really fun going to school on a Monday morning in the fall, because Notre Dame usually won and the Catholic kids could hold their heads high and be proud to be Catholic.
They adopted the Notre Dame team as their alumni, and they were the most popular team in America. And one man did it, Knute Rockne. Does one man make a college? Well, he nearly did.
I mean, the biggest weekend in New York was the Army-Notre Dame game. Couldn't get a hotel room. That was the Super Bowl in New York. Wherever Notre Dame went was big with Rockne. Rockne was bigger than life. He was as huge as any celebrity.
College football was on a huge roll at the time. Crowds of 100,000 or more at Soldier Field. It was clearly one of America's top sports pastimes, and nobody was more popular than Knute Rockne and Notre Dame.
He popularized Notre Dame through winning. That's the easiest way to popularize anything in this country, especially a sports team.
He won 105 games, lost 12 in 13 years, and tied 5. His record is the highest percentage winning record of all time.
In 5 of Rockne's 13 seasons as head coach, Notre Dame was undefeated, winning 3 national championships.
But he also was an initiator of various new things in football. He, for instance, brought about the famous Notre Dame shift.
He saw the Rockettes on Broadway and saw them going through their routine and got the idea of the shift and the way the dancers moved, and he thought that that would be applicable for a new formation at Notre Dame.
I remember it had a rhythmic motion to it, and everybody moved on the same count.
28, 15, 32. Hip. 1, 2, 3. Hip.
Rockne's shift was executed to perfection in 1924, especially by a backfield that passed into legend when sports writer Grantland Rice described them as the Four Horsemen: Harry Stuhldreher, Don Miller, Jim Crowley, and Elmer Layden.
That's kind of the start of Notre Dame spreading throughout the nation. Grantland Rice would write a story. It would appear on the front page of a New York newspaper, but it would also appear on the front page in newspapers in San Francisco, Houston, Kansas City.
Rockne rode the Four Horsemen to Notre Dame's first national championship with an undefeated season, capped by a 27-10 victory over Stanford in the 1925 Rose Bowl.
What he really did was take that Notre Dame team and say, we want to play the best. They were called the Ramblers. They played from coast to coast, West Coast, East Coast, against the best opponents they can find.
He booked USC, which is out in California. He booked teams in the Midwest and the Southwest and in the South. Mind you, this was 60, 70 years ago when football teams didn't move around.
They not only popularized football and made it a national sport, but they also popularized Notre Dame and made it a national university.
But don't forget, man, we're going to get them on a run. We're going to go, 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 go. And we aren't...
One thing that struck me, and it did every time I ever heard him, and that was his tremendous voice and his wonderful rolling command.
You want to say, man?
Okay.
Well, it certainly gets your blood running, and it gets you motivated, and it gets you ready to play a football game or any event. When you hear him speaking, it's like you can do anything as a result of hearing him speak.
There was a story of the time that they were losing a game, and he walked into the locker room and he held up a piece of paper,
waving this telegram saying how very, very ill his son was back in South Bend.
He exhorted his team at halftime to win it for his son Billy.
So they went out and they beat Georgia Tech, and they came back on the train. And the first person there at the station, of course, was Rockne's son, who was in fine health.
Billy was not sick and he was not in the hospital. But with Rockne, this was all, let's say, permissive fibbing.
He was a con man, and he used his personality and his uniqueness to get the name of Rockne and Notre Dame across the country.
But there was no faking his painful attacks of phlebitis, forcing Rockne to direct the action from a wheelchair on occasion in 1929 and 1930. Even so, the Irish went 19-0 and won back-to-back national championships.
My father always said that Knute Rockne was 10 years ahead of every coach in the country. And then he used to add, if he had lived, he still would have stayed 10 years ahead of every coach.
In the early spring of 1931, Rockne interrupted his off-season to pursue an offer he couldn't refuse.
They were vacationing in Florida, and Grandma knew that Grandpa was going out to California to make a movie. Grandma asked Grandpa not to fly, and Grandpa, being the avant-garde kind of individually, didn't see a problem with flying.
He was truly interested in promoting Notre Dame football, and this new medium, the celluloid medium, was beckoning him.
He was on that plane going to Hollywood to sign a contract for $50,000 to make a movie.
Well, he loved speed on the football field, I know that. And I think the fact that airplanes could bring him to a point quicker than he could get by train fascinated him.
At that time, you know, not many people were flying. It was strictly a very, very unusual thing for people to fly, and those people who were using airplanes in those days usually were people who had money.
There was still an image of the daring barnstormer who took his life in his hands every time he left the ground.
Don't forget that it was only 4 years before that Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic solo in his Spirit of St. Louis monoplane.
He loved risks. He had taken risks in his life and pushed the envelope. He just was one of these people.
On the morning of March 31st, 1931, a light snow fell over Kansas City.
Rockne was at Union Station, the train station in Kansas City. He had breakfast scheduled with his 2 teenage sons who were attending school in Kansas City at the time, but the train was late. Rockne couldn't wait. His plane was about to take off.
And so didn't get a chance to wave goodbye to him, so he took off, and they arrived a little bit late, didn't see him, and that was the last chapter of Knute's life.
Cottonwood Falls and Bizarre, Kansas are in the Flint Hills area of the state of Kansas. A very unique geographic area where nothing grows there, but it's flat and it's rolling. And you can actually stand there and look to the west and see for miles and miles. It's almost if you're standing on a seashore looking out at the ocean.
Everybody lived a simple life. Up and down those creeks, if they had 160 acres to farm, why, they'd have hogs and cattle and a milk cow or two and always a big flock of chickens. And they survived out there.
Rockne was traveling with 5 other passengers plus a pilot and co-pilot when their Fokker F-10A trimotor encountered a thick fog soon after takeoff.
The plane was on its way to Los Angeles, but it was making a stop in Wichita, and they had contacted Wichita They were going to turn back, but Wichita told them that it was clear there.
So they actually made a complete circle, and in doing so, they were headed back into the same type of weather that they were trying to get out of.
Boy, she was foggy. I heard this plane go over, but I couldn't see it. It was just so foggy you couldn't see mowers.
Ed and Arthur Baker were the two boys that lived there on this place. They heard this plane circling around several times. They couldn't see it. And they said all of a sudden, it just sounded like a whole bunch of 50-gallon oil drums crashing together.
I was out the barn getting another sack of corn to bring to the house when I heard those motors roaring down north. It sounded like a couple cars racing.
And they looked over there and actually couldn't see very much, but when they looked up in the air, this one wing had broke off and it was just kind of lazily circling down.
Why, the wing came fluttering down just like a piece of paper. When the plane came out of the clouds, it would turn end over end, and it traveled, well, about 3/8 of a mile. It had been measured as 1,900 feet from where the wing laid until where the plane went in the ground. But you can imagine what that few seconds ride must have been like in that plane cartwheeling.
They said, come on, there's an airplane went down. Well, of course, hell, nothing happens out there very often that rouses up everybody. So I tore to the house and got in the dang car and started out there.
We walked around the wreckage, and there was 5 bodies laying out west and just a little south.
We decided to try to get the shoes and the clothes piled with closest to the body, so when they did attempt to identify them, they'd kind of know where the pieces came from.
I think there was 300 or 400 people out there. They all come, either horseback or afoot, just to see that thing.
By all accounts, there was an awful lot of looting. People walked off with everything you can imagine that could have been walked off with.
I picked up a little old rubber, I don't know what you'd call it, a washer or something about that big around.
People went to flocking out there and stealing wheels and parts off of the crashed airplane. Everybody was a curiosity seeker.
The sheriff had to post deputies to keep the looters and the souvenir hunters away.
But after noon, they brought information out that Knute Rockne had been on that plane and 7 others. So I said, well, I know which one he was. He was that old bald-headed man that was out there the next to the outer end. And I helped gather up the pieces and piled it up there.
When the ambulances got there, they started picking up the bodies. They picked up the body on the north end, and they picked up Rockne's body. And I was standing there, and there was a wrap around one leg of the body.
And I think one of the observers on the local newspaper in the area said that Rockne was clutching his rosary beads at the time of his death.
Rockne was not holding a rosary when it went down. And the reason I know this is that Easter told me a gentleman that he knew that stayed by the body of Rockne, waiting for his children to come see him. So he guarded all his personal effects. Rockne did have in his possession, in his pocket, a rosary.
It took about a week for me to get over the shock of being out there and seeing that mess. As a kid, kind of bothered me for a while.
That kind of got to me. That was the first dead people I had ever seen. That hot oil smell, I can still think about it and smell it yet today.
newspaper boys were yelling, "Rockne killed, Rockne killed." Everybody was just shocked.
People would call up newspapers and say, "Is it true?" Apparently, the Chicago Tribune telephone operators were answering, instead of saying this is the Chicago Tribune, "Yes, it's true about Rockne."
Well, I was in high school in a town called Freeport, Illinois, and the broadcast came on the radio, and I was in English class with Miss Musser, was a teacher. She came into the room and she went up to the blackboard and put Rudy Rockne's name on the blackboard and said, "This man had just died in a plane crash."
I was on my way home from school, and I had an old friend. His name was Lineberry Hill. He ran a general store in my little town of Denton, North Carolina, and he was back in the back of his store stoking up the pot-bellied stove, and he saw me coming, and he looked up and he said, "Furman, Knute Rockne got killed today," like we had lost a close personal friend.
South Bend was in mourning, and all the students and faculty and the people who associated with Notre Dame were in mourning.
I had a class at Notre Dame that day, and there was two roommates that I had, Ray and Jim. I came home and went upstairs to the room. They seemed down in the dumps about something, and I said, "What was wrong?" And they said, "Rockne was killed." And I said, "It can't be, because I rode out to school with Rock just yesterday."
It was a tragic event, and I think it had a desolating effect on the school itself for some time.
It was both tragic and confirmed people's sense that heroes have walked among us, and the tragedy of a very talented person being cut down in their prime with much left to accomplish.
Tom O'Neill, who was a classmate of Rockne, and Frank Wallace, who wrote several books about Notre Dame, both came to the Rockne home in Coral Gables after they heard about the death. Mrs. Rockne was not at home at the time because she had taken the children over to Miami Beach so they could play in the sand. When she returned, Wallace and O'Neill were there to meet her, and they were the first ones to tell her that Rockne had been killed.
She was devastated. That man was her whole life.
There were just two children there at that time, Mary Jean and little Jackie, when she broke the news to the children. Mary Jean was very close to her dad and took it extremely hard. Jackie didn't quite grasp what was going on, being a 5-year-old, but it was very, very hard for the Rockne family.
As the fallen hero's body was prepared for transport back in Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, Rockne's two older sons, William and Knute Jr., were on their way from Kansas City.
There was a embalmer from Kansas City that came and worked on Mr. Rockne all night long.
Rockne's college roommate was a Kansas City physician named D.M. Nigro. Nigro heard about the crash, drove the sons to the crash site, and identified the body.
He told the boys before they went that your father has been very seriously injured. As they got to Cottonwood Falls, they pulled up in front of the funeral parlor, and I believe it was Knute Jr., who was the younger of the two boys, told him, "This doesn't look like a hospital to me." And Dr. Nigro told him, "Be a sport now. Your father was a great man. He was known by everybody. He was loved by everybody."
They shipped him out by train over to Strong City, took him over to the depot and shipped him out.
As the train bearing Rockne's body passed through the dozens of little towns on the 15-hour journey to his final resting place, residents lined the platforms to pay their respects.
I understand when they came through Chicago that there was a group of Notre Dame alumni that also got on the train and brought it back to South Bend.
And apparently, people learned that the body was coming in. 10,000 people turned out on the route between these two train stations.
In the late evening of April 1st, thousands more were waiting at the South Bend Railroad Station. For the next 2 days, Rockne's closed casket was viewed at his home, while arrangements for the funeral were being made.
The funeral was scheduled for the 4th of April at the Basilica on the Notre Dame campus. There was talk, there was some pressure, not pressure, but request put on Bonnie to have the funeral at Notre Dame Stadium. Rockne had designed the stadium It would seat roughly, I guess, 50,000 people at that time, and they thought it would be very nice to have the funeral in Notre Dame Stadium so more people could come. And she said, no, absolutely not. She wanted it at the cathedral.
A candle that was burning so brightly in terms of national prominence and success was snuffed out. I think there was a sort of brutal fact about life that came about because of someone of his prominence that was taken away so suddenly in a tragic plane crash.
Following Rockne's death, the public was outraged when newspapers reported that an intense federal investigation had revealed that the crash could have been avoided.
Even though there were only, and I use that term only, 8 people killed in that crash, it was the worst air disaster in American history up until that period of time.
With the Federal Aviation Administration not yet in existence, the crash was investigated by the Aeronautics Branch of the Department of Commerce. Of primary concern was the detached wing.
The wing was wood glued together, and that was also not unusual for that era.
The glue that held the wood together had deteriorated through exposure to moisture, and that it's possible that the wing was weakened.
The wing actually came off, and it was due, I think, to the weight of the ice, because they were only at 1,500 feet, but they still had power. And when they pulled up, it just was the weight of the ice, and trying to pull up too fast snapped the wing.
An airmail pilot who was also in the vicinity and encountered those conditions could just barely remain airborne with full power because of all the ice accumulated on his airplane.
At the time of the crash, there was no standard communication, that not all aircraft had two-way radio systems. And so a plane that was up in inclement weather was basically on its own in many instances.
In what was regarded as an attempt to silence the public outcry, Department of Commerce officials offered several updated explanations for the wing's failure, each a little less damning. But one story was never told.
One inspector, Department of Commerce, had some doubts about that wing, and he actually informed the people in Washington. He says, I really worry about what could be going on inside that wing. There were people in the Bureau that had some doubts too.
Subsequent to the crash, the investigation found that some parts of the wing were not glued. The glue joints were not very good.
And they did find moisture. They didn't do anything about it. Rockne was killed. The accident ward said the pilot took it to a steep dive, which he shouldn't have, and the wing ripped off. Pilot error. Now, I think there may have been an intent to cover up a little bit.
Cover up or no cover up, the F-10A was extinct by 1934. But the attention to air safety created by the plane's crash may have saved countless lives.
The Department of Commerce ended up grounding the F-10s and the F-10As, and they required an inspection of the interior of the wing joints, and in order to do that, one had to cut into the plywood covering of the wing. So this became a very expensive and time-consuming inspection.
That was the end of the F-10A. Some airlines even took out off the engines and burnt the aircraft because there was no way that they could afford to conduct that kind of an inspection and make ends meet.
After the crash and the death of Rockne, this is what spurred the U.S. government to put together, a federal regulatory group on aviation.
They did not have the authority to subpoena witnesses or to require sworn testimony. They had a very small staff. All these things came to light, and they received the authority that they needed to conduct these investigations. And eventually there was improved legislation aimed at the safety of airplanes.
And from then on, I think almost all the aircraft built, particularly for the airlines, were all metal, had metal wings.
It brought to the forefront in the conscience of the American public that airplane travel could be risky. And because of Rockne's death in an airplane crash, I think that people began to think a second about going into an airplane.
Had Rockne not been aboard that aircraft, the aeronautics branch would probably not have followed through, and there would have been more accidents with that particular airplane. So in a sense, we owe Rockne something, but in a sense, another sense, Rockne should not have died on that aircraft.
Upon Rockne's death, the wheels of America's myth-making machinery began to grind. As publishing houses paid advances on a spate of biographies, magazines, newspapers, and radio programs continued to spin the legend. But it was the 1940 movie, Knute Rockne, All-American, that forged him into a cultural icon.
In 1929, Collier's magazine decided it wanted to do the autobiography of Knute Rockne. And a writer named John B. Kennedy talked to Rockne, went back to New York, and wrote essentially the autobiography. And Rockne was very busy that year. He was also sick that year, and essentially just let Kennedy do what he wanted. And one of the things that Kennedy began is the win one for the Gipper speech. And that is used in the movie and is probably the most famous scene in the movie.
Ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Gipper.
You've got Ronald Reagan as the Gipper and dying young and all of that, and many legends about Rockne are perpetuated and codified and set into concrete, really, by that movie. And Ronald Reagan having uttered it, it becomes crucial to his political thing. He becomes known as the Gipper, and it goes on and on.
I think Ronald Reagan was a pretty astute politician, and he realized that he could take this a long way.
And if you would, I hope you'll just win one more for the Gipper.
Win one for the Gipper. Everybody knows that speech, especially since the Gipper made it to the White House for 2 terms.
Reagan loved the Rockne myths from day one. Maybe Rockne's greatest contribution to America was he certainly helped build the essential Reagan mystique.
I'll do anything on earth to make you happy. You know that, don't you?
I know that.
Movies of that era tended to be a little mom and pop type apple pie and motherhood, so it just got the myth going again about this great man.
Publicly, Bonnie always said Knute was the most loving of fathers and the most attentive of fathers. And she had that added to the script at Warner's for Knute Rockne, All-American. But in fact, Knute was a workaholic. You know, the real Rockne was the guy who grew up in Logan Square, a hard-scrabble guy who hung out at Hully and Mike's pool hall and betting parlor and loved back rooms, loved smoking cigars with his newspapermen cronies, who also were rough and tumble guys. She goes through the script constantly before they begin filming. And anytime the script writers gave a hint of the rough and tumble Rockne, she would have it taken out. He becomes, for the next generation or two, Saint Knute.
While heartwarming to a nation, the canonization of Rockne was hard on his family.
The kids, I think, try to live up to their dad, the things that he had stood for and so forth. And all of them, the 3 boys, really felt that the mantle was on them now to carry forth the Rockne name.
He didn't leave his wife that well provided for, although she did well off of his life and made money from Warner's and other people.
Problems was when he was killed. And then she couldn't take it for a long time. She became isolated. She just wouldn't meet the public, and it went on for weeks.
I think in the beginning it was very difficult because she had to learn to handle the money. She had the sole responsibility of 4 children to take care of. She had a house. She still had all the social obligations from being the wife of Knute Rockne.
After Knute died, Bonnie became a single parent, of course, never remarried, and she became the real catalyst for that family.
I know that my dad was still close to Bonnie Rockne, and I recall that we went over to visit with her, but I can't imagine any father figure that would have stepped in.
Obviously, this must have put a lot of pressure on Bonnie, and then he dies when the kids are still fairly young. So she's left holding the bag. Notre Dame is very helpful. Notre Dame helps her out in all kinds of ways. But she probably never squared it in her head to have to live up to this public image.
All of a sudden, everybody was talking about a different Knute Rockne than they knew, and it was hard for them to talk about the individual feelings and experiences they had with their dad, because Knute Rockne just wasn't their dad. Knute Rockne was Notre Dame.
The eldest son, Billy, had a very troubled career. He was in and out of trouble with the law. The youngest son, Jack, had a very sad life in that he was alcoholic most of his life.
I think one of the reasons why my father is kind of hesitant to talk about it is just that it still even today is an event that foreshadowed everything in his life.
The one that took it the hardest was Jack, because I was at the house with him quite often, and he just kept saying, "I want my daddy, I want my daddy."
It's almost like there's a shield around my dad. He won't go there. He won't take that and talk about his personal feelings.
Well, he kept that ache in his heart for years, and probably even today he still has it.
I think it can be very tough if they're always identified as the son of rather than their own person.
The daughter probably did best in this macho world of sports that Knute Rockne lived in. Daughters were somewhat exempt from it, and she seems to have had a successful, normal life. It's both a very familiar story and it's a very sad story. It's all mixed up with this public image, particularly of the saint.
Rockne is not only the greatest coach of the 20th century in college football, he's the most important individual of the 20th century in college football.
We look at Rockne the way baseball looks and remembers at Babe Ruth, the way boxing remembers Jack Dempsey. We remember him as the first great public figure of his sport.
Under his tutelage, an extraordinary number of men went out and coached at other schools. I think the number was somewhere in 40 or 50 men who became either head coaches or assistant coaches at other schools, and that was probably his greatest legacy.
When legends die young, the legend grows with each passing year.
The immediate reaction I had was how simple it was. And yet, the fact that it was out in the middle of nowhere lent almost a cathedral quiet to it. And it was a very striking ambiance.
When the sun shone, why, there were just hundreds of little pieces strewn around there. We surely noticed them gleaming around in the dirt there. Those pieces have been there a long time.
Standing in the vastness of the Kansas prairie, a monument bears silent witness to the tragedy. Easter Heathman, who remembers that day in 1931, remains its de facto caretaker.
If it hadn't been for good old Easter, by God, this thing probably would just kind of died out. But by God, boy, he has done a job.
Even to this day, there are people that go try to contact Easter that just see it as a speck on the map saying Rockne crash site and try to find it.
I got to visit the actual site where the plane crashed and spent some time with Easter Heathman, who is the unofficial official caretaker of that plane crash site. And to listen to him talk about the plane crash, I mean, that'll put chills in anybody's spine.
It's amazing when you finally see something, touch something that you've heard about all your life. The monument is simple and yet profound. And when you stop and think that on that very earth is the place where history, profound history occurred, it's quite touching, quite moving.
I think the way people view history says more about the times they live in than the times the historical figures lived in.
I would say the excitement or the enthusiasm that people had of Rockne and the football team was probably more in New York than it was in Bazaar. The ties are just with a handful of people that grew up out there at that particular time in life. I don't think it means that much.
I think it means a lot to Mr. Heathman because he was there. He was a young boy. I think he was only 13 years old when this happened. And of course, at that age, to see something that tragic, that catastrophic, had to create a lifelong impact on him emotionally.
This is his passion. This is his reason to be. But realistically, once he does pass away, the interest in it will wane only because access to the monument is difficult.
I have high school kids that come out about every year. There's one or two, and they'll write a thesis, and they'll choose the life and story of Knute Rockne. And I help these kids all I can. I sure hope somebody else will do it. I'll do it as long as I can, because it definitely needs to be done. Somebody needs to take an interest in it and do it.
Rockne's legacy in South Bend is cast not so much in stone as in concrete. When he oversaw the design of Notre Dame's new stadium back in 1930, the school board wondered why so much land had been left vacant around the 54,000-seat edifice. When Rockne explained the land was for people to park their cars, the priests protested that the vast majority of fans didn't even own cars. "Oh, they will, fathers," said Rockne. They will. For SportsCenter Flashback, I'm Charlie Steiner.